The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as tourists gathered along the metal barriers. Among them stood Marcus Thompson, a 28-year-old construction worker from Manchester who had driven down to London with his girlfriend Sarah for what was supposed to be a romantic weekend getaway. The couple had planned to visit all the famous landmarks, take photos, and make memories that would last a lifetime. Marcus had always been a bit of a hothead. Growing up in the rough neighborhoods of Manchester, he learned early that respect was something you had to demand, not ask for. His broad shoulders and calloused hands told the story of a man who worked hard for everything he had. Sarah often worried about his temper, especially when he'd had a few drinks the night before, which he certainly had at the pub near their hotel. The changing of the guard ceremony was about to begin, and the crowd pressed closer to the barriers, families with children, elderly couples with cameras, and groups of international tourists all jostled for the best viewing positions. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. This was one of London's most famous traditions, dating back centuries, and everyone wanted to witness the precision and pageantry of the Queen's Guard. Marcus found himself growing irritated by the pushing crowd. A Japanese tourist accidentally stepped on his foot while trying to get a better photo angle. An elderly woman with a large hat blocked his view just as the ceremony was beginning. Sarah squeezed his arm gently, sensing his mounting frustration, but Marcus was already feeling that familiar heat rising in his chest. The guards began their march across the courtyard, their red tunics blazing in the morning light, their tall, bearskin hats adding an extra foot to their already imposing height. Their movements were perfectly synchronized, each step measured and deliberate. These weren't just ceremonial soldiers putting on a show for tourists. They were active military personnel, trained combat veterans who took their duty to protect the royal family with deadly seriousness. Guard James Wellington had been serving with the Grenadier Guards for 6 years. At 24, he had already completed 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan and had earned the respect of his commanding officers for his discipline and dedication. Standing at attention during ceremonies like this was second nature to him, but he never let his guard down completely. His training had taught him to be aware of everything happening around him, even while maintaining the stoic expression that tourists expected. As the guards marched past the barriers, Marcus felt someone push him from behind. He turned to see a group of teenagers trying to get closer to the fence, laughing and joking as they squeezed through the crowd. One of them, a lanky boy with a backwards baseball cap, smirked at Marcus when their eyes met. It was exactly the kind of disrespectful behavior that set Marcus off on his best days, and today was far from his best day. Sarah noticed the change in her boyfriend's demeanor immediately. His jaw was clenched, his fists were beginning to ball up, and she could practically feel the anger radiating from him. She had seen this look before, usually right before Marcus got into trouble. She tugged at his sleeve, whispering for him to calm down, reminding him that they were supposed to be having a good time together. But Marcus was no longer listening to Sarah or anyone else. His focus had shifted entirely to the guards marching past, their faces expressionless, their eyes staring straight ahead as if the crowd of people didn't even exist. To Marcus, this looked like arrogance, like these soldiers thought they were better than everyone else. In his alcohol-fogged mind, their disciplined silence became a personal insult. The crowd around them continued to grow more excited as the ceremony reached its peak, but Marcus felt increasingly isolated and angry. He watched as Guard Wellington approached his section of the barrier, marching with the same measured steps as his colleagues, his rifle held perfectly at his side. The morning that had started as a romantic adventure was about to take a turn that would change both men's lives forever. The tension in Marcus's body was building like pressure in a boiler. His girlfriend Sarah could sense something terrible was about to happen, but the crowd around them was so thick and noisy that she couldn't get his full attention. Children were squealing with delight, cameras were clicking constantly, and tour guides were shouting information in different languages. In this chaos, Marcus's growing rage went unnoticed by everyone except Sarah. Guard Wellington continued, his march, completely focused on his duty. He had performed this ceremony hundreds of times, and muscle memory guided his every step. His peripheral vision caught the usual sights, Tourists waving, children pointing, phones recording, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The morning was crisp and clear, perfect weather for the ceremony, and he was looking forward to completing his shift without incident. Behind the barriers, Marcus's mind was racing with angry thoughts. The teenager who had pushed past him was now taking selfies, completely oblivious to Marcus's glare. The elderly woman with the hat had moved again, this time stepping partially on his foot as she adjusted her position. Every small annoyance was adding fuel to the fire burning inside him. Sarah made one more desperate attempt to defuse the situation. She grabbed Marcus's arm firmly and suggested they move to a different spot, maybe grab some coffee and come back later when the crowd thinned out. But Marcus shrugged her off, his eyes now locked on the approaching guards. In his twisted state of mind, he began to see their ceremonial march as some kind of mockery, as if these soldiers were deliberately ignoring the people who came to see them. The irony was devastating. Marcus had actually served briefly in the army himself, though he had been discharged early due to disciplinary problems. He should have understood the discipline and training that went into ceremonies like this. But his personal disappointments and current frustration had clouded his judgment completely. Guard Wellington was now just a few feet away from Marcus's section of the barrier. His training had taught him to ignore distractions, to maintain focus even when tourists tried to get reactions from him. Some people would wave frantically, others would make jokes or even mild insults, but the guards were expected to remain stoic and professional at all times. It was part of the mystique, part of what made the ceremony so impressive to visitors from around the world. Marcus watched as Wellington approached, and something inside him snapped. Later, he would struggle to explain exactly what had driven him to do what he did next. Perhaps it was the accumulation of small frustrations throughout the morning. Maybe it was the alcohol still affecting his judgment. Or it could have been deeper issues. His struggles with unemployment, his feeling that life had been unfair to him, his need to prove himself in situations where he felt powerless. The crowd around them was completely absorbed in the spectacle. Cameras were capturing every moment of the ceremony. Parents were lifting children onto their shoulders for better views, and the general atmosphere was one of joy and wonder. No one was paying attention to the angry man standing tensely at the barrier, his girlfriend desperately trying to calm him down. Sarah made one final attempt to prevent disaster. She moved in front of Marcus, blocking his view of the guards, and spoke directly into his ear, telling him that people were starting to stare at him, that he was making a scene, that they should leave immediately. For a moment her words seemed to penetrate the fog of his anger, and Marcus looked at her with what might have been recognition. But then Guard Wellington marched directly past them, so close that Marcus could have reached out and touched his uniform. The guard's eyes were focused straight ahead, his expression completely neutral, his posture perfect. To the crowd, he represented everything that was dignified and impressive about British military tradition. To Marcus, in his disturbed state of mind, the guard's professional demeanor felt like the ultimate insult. The decision formed in Marcus's mind in a split second. All his anger, frustration, and wounded pride focused on the uniformed figure marching past him. Without warning, without thinking about consequences, without considering the dozens of witnesses around him, Marcus made the choice that would define the rest of this day. His hand moved toward the barrier, his body tensed for action, and Sarah's worst fears were about to become reality. Time seemed to slow down as Marcus reached across the metal barrier. His muscular arm extended toward Guard Wellington, his fist clenched and aimed directly at the soldier's jaw. The crowd around him was still cheering and taking photos, completely unaware of the violence about to unfold just inches away from them. Guard Wellington's training kicked in before his conscious mind had fully processed what was happening. Years of military service had honed his reflexes to lightning speed, and his peripheral vision caught the movement of Marcus's arm. Even while maintaining his ceremonial pace, Wellington's body was already beginning to react to the threat. The punch connected with a sickening thud that cut through the crowd noise like a knife. Marcus had put all of his construction worker strength behind the blow, and it caught Wellington squarely on the side of his face. The impact was so sudden and unexpected that several nearby tourists screamed in shock. Children began crying, and the festive atmosphere of the ceremony instantly turned to chaos and panic. Wellington staggered but didn't fall. His military training had taught him how to absorb hits and keep functioning even when injured. Blood began to trickle from his mouth and his left cheek was already starting to swell, but his eyes remained focused and alert. The ceremonial facade had been shattered, and now the combat veteran underneath was fully engaged. Sarah screamed Marcus's name in horror, realizing that her worst fears had come true. She had spent months trying to help him control his temper, and now he had just assaulted a member of the Queen's Guard in front of hundreds of witnesses. The romantic weekend in London had become a nightmare in the span of seconds. The other guards in the formation immediately broke from their ceremonial positions. These were not actors or performers. They were trained soldiers, and one of their colleagues had just been attacked. Within moments, 3 guards had converged on Marcus's position, their ceremonial weapons now held in defensive positions as they surrounded the attacker. Marcus seemed to realize the magnitude of what he had done as soon as his fist made contact with Wellington's face. The rage that had been building all morning suddenly evaporated, replaced by a cold fear as he saw the professional soldiers moving to surround him. His brief moment of violent satisfaction was immediately overwhelmed by the understanding that he had made a terrible, life-changing mistake. Wellington wiped the blood from his mouth with the back of his gloved hand and looked directly at Marcus for the first time. There was no anger in his eyes, no desire for revenge, just the cold, calculating gaze of a soldier assessing a threat. He had been trained to remain professional even under the most extreme circumstances, and this situation, while shocking, was something he could handle. The crowd began to scatter as people realized what had happened. Parents grabbed their children and moved away from the barrier. Tourists fumbled with their cameras to record the unprecedented scene, and the general mood shifted from celebration to fear and confusion. Some people were shouting for help. Others were calling the police on their mobile phones, and a few brave souls were trying to get closer to see what would happen next. Marcus found himself trapped between the metal barrier and the approaching guards. Behind him, the crowd was pressing back in panic, giving him no room to escape. In front of him, Wellington and his colleagues were closing in with military precision. Sarah was somewhere in the crowd, crying and calling his name, but he couldn't see her through the chaos. The reality of his situation began to sink in. He had just committed assault in one of the most secure locations in London, in front of hundreds of witnesses, against a member of the Queen's personal guard. The consequences would be swift and severe, and there was absolutely no way to take back what he had done. Wellington raised his hand, signaling to his fellow guards to hold their positions. Despite the blood on his face and the throbbing pain in his jaw, he was still thinking tactically. The situation needed to be contained quickly and professionally, without further injury to anyone in the crowd. Marcus was clearly no longer a threat. The fight had gone out of him as soon as he realized what he had done. The seconds stretched into eternity, as Marcus stood frozen, surrounded by guards, with nowhere to run, and no way to undo his moment of explosive anger. The ceremony that thousands of tourists had come to see had been transformed into a crime scene, and Marcus was about to discover just how seriously the British authorities took threats to the royal family and their protectors. The takedown was swift and professional. Guard Wellington, despite the blood still dripping from his injured face, coordinated with his colleagues using hand signals that Marcus couldn't understand, but that spoke to years of military training and teamwork. Within seconds, Marcus found himself face down on the cobblestone courtyard, his arms twisted behind his back and held firmly in place by 2 guards, while a third kept watch over the surrounding crowd. The pain in Marcus's shoulders was immediate and intense as the guards applied pressure to keep him subdued. The rough stone scraped against his cheek as he struggled briefly before realizing the futility of resistance. These weren't security guards or police officers. They were elite soldiers who had been trained to handle much more dangerous situations than one angry tourist. Sarah had managed to push through the panicking crowd and was now screaming Marcus's name from behind the barrier. She could see her boyfriend pinned to the ground, surrounded by guards in their distinctive red uniforms, and she knew that their lives had just changed forever. Tears streamed down her face as she realized that the man she loved had just destroyed his future in a moment of uncontrolled rage. Wellington knelt beside Marcus, his professional demeanor intact despite his injuries. He spoke in a calm, measured voice that somehow made the situation even more intimidating than if he had been shouting. He informed Marcus that he was being detained for assault on a member of Her Majesty's Guard, and that additional security forces were already on their way. The ceremony had been suspended, and the entire area was now being treated as a crime scene. The crowd around them had transformed from excited tourists into shocked witnesses. Many people were recording the scene on their phones, ensuring that Marcus's moment of violence would be preserved forever and likely shared across social media within hours. Some tourists were asking each other what had happened, while others were already calling friends and family to describe the unprecedented incident they had just witnessed. Marcus tried to speak, to apologize or explain, but one of the guards firmly told him to remain silent. His words came out as muffled groans against the stone courtyard anyway, mixed with the taste of blood from where his lip had been cut during the takedown. The reality of his situation was becoming clearer with each passing second. He had assaulted a soldier at one of the most heavily monitored locations in the world. Within minutes, the sound of sirens filled the air as police vehicles and additional security personnel arrived at the scene. The efficiency of the response was remarkable. It was clear that protocols for this type of incident had been well established and practiced. Marcus realized that he was likely not the first person to lose control during a royal ceremony, though his attack had been more direct and violent than most disturbances. Wellington finally stood up, accepting a medical kit from a colleague who had appeared seemingly from nowhere. He began treating his own injuries with practiced efficiency, cleaning the blood from his face and assessing the damage to his jaw. Despite the pain, which Marcus could see in the slight tightening around the guard's eyes, Wellington continued to project an aura of complete professionalism. The police officers who arrived at the scene were clearly familiar with working alongside the royal guards. They took control of Marcus from the soldiers with seamless coordination, lifting him to his feet and securing him with proper restraints. Marcus's legs were shaky, whether from adrenaline, fear, or the awkward position he had been held in, and he nearly stumbled as they guided him toward a waiting police van. Sarah was now being questioned by officers who had appeared at her side. She was frantically trying to explain that Marcus wasn't normally like this, that he had been drinking, that he was under stress from work problems. Her words came out in a rush of desperate explanations, but the officers listened with the patient expression of people who had heard similar stories many times before. As Marcus was led away from the scene, he caught a glimpse of Guard Wellington, who was now standing at attention once again despite his injuries, ready to continue with his duties as soon as the area was cleared. The contrast between the two men was stark. One had lost control completely and destroyed his life in a moment of anger, while the other had maintained his discipline and professionalism even while under attack. The crowd was slowly being dispersed by additional security personnel who had arrived to restore order to the area. The ceremony would not continue today, but the tourists were being assured that they could return another day to see the traditional changing of the guard under more normal circumstances. For most of them, however, what they had witnessed would be far more memorable than any ceremonial display could have been. Marcus's last clear thought before being placed in the police van was the devastating realization that his life as he knew it was over. Everything that would follow, the arrest, the charges, the trial, the consequences, had all been set in motion by a single moment of uncontrolled anger that he would spend years regretting. The police station was a blur of harsh fluorescent lights and echoing footsteps as Marcus was processed through the system. His head was pounding, whether from the alcohol wearing off, the stress of the situation, or the rough treatment during his arrest, he couldn't tell. The reality of what he had done was sinking in deeper with each form that was filled out, each photograph that was taken, each question that was asked by the stern-faced officers handling his case. Sarah had followed the police convoy to the station, driving their rental car with shaking hands while tears streamed down her face. She had called Marcus's brother back in Manchester, barely able to explain what had happened through her sobs. The brother had promised to find a lawyer and drive down to London immediately, but Sarah felt completely alone and overwhelmed by the legal system that was now processing the man she loved. Detective Inspector Caroline Hughes had seen plenty of tourist incidents during her 15 years with the Metropolitan Police, but attacks on the Royal Guards were rare and always taken extremely seriously. As she reviewed Marcus's file, she noted his previous military service and his clean record, aside from a few minor pub fights in his youth. This made his attack on Guard Wellington even more puzzling and concerning. The interview room was small and windowless, designed to make suspects feel isolated and encourage them to cooperate. Marcus sat across from Detective Hughes, his hands still shaking slightly from the adrenaline crash. He had been read his rights, but the words had seemed to float past him without fully registering. Everything felt surreal, like he was watching someone else's life fall apart. Hughes began the interview by asking Marcus to explain what had led to his attack on the guard. For the first time since the incident, Marcus was forced to put into words the confused mixture of anger, frustration, and poor judgment that had driven him to violence. As he spoke, he realized how weak and ridiculous his explanations sounded. Being pushed by teenagers, being annoyed by other tourists, feeling ignored by the guards, none of it justified what he had done. Meanwhile, at a nearby hospital, Guard E. Wellington was undergoing medical evaluation for his injuries. The punch had caused significant swelling to his face and had loosened one of his teeth, but there was no permanent damage. The medical staff were amazed by his calm demeanor throughout the examination. Even while being treated for injuries sustained in an unprovoked attack, Wellington maintained the discipline and composure that defined his service record. Back at the police station, Marcus was learning about the serious charges he would be facing. Assault on a member of the royal household was treated as a particularly grave offense under British law. The prosecutor who had been called in explained that Marcus could face several years in prison, especially given that the attack had occurred at such a high-security royal location and had been witnessed by hundreds of people. Sarah was allowed to see Marcus briefly before he was moved to a holding cell. The conversation was heartbreaking. She alternated between anger at his stupidity and desperate concern for his future. Marcus apologized repeatedly, but they both knew that sorry wouldn't undo the damage he had caused to both their lives. Sarah would have to return to Manchester alone and somehow explain to their friends and families how a romantic weekend had ended with her boyfriend in jail. The news media had gotten hold of the story within hours of the incident. Video footage taken by tourists was already being broadcast on news channels, and Marcus's name and photograph were being shared across social media platforms. The incident was being described as an unprecedented security breach, and commentators were discussing what it revealed about threats to the royal family and their protectors. Guard Wellington had returned to his barracks, where his commanding officers were conducting their own investigation into the incident. His response to the attack was being praised as exemplary. He had maintained discipline under pressure, coordinated effectively with his colleagues, and ensured that the situation was contained without additional violence or injury to bystanders. His professionalism during the crisis would likely be noted in his service record. As night fell over London, Marcus lay on a narrow cot in his cell, staring at the ceiling and replaying the morning's events in his mind. Every decision he had made seemed obviously wrong in retrospect. If he had listened to Sarah's pleas to leave, if he had controlled his temper, if he had simply walked away from the ceremony when he started feeling angry, any of these choices could have prevented the disaster that had unfolded. The legal process was just beginning for Marcus. He would spend the weekend in custody before his first court appearance on Monday, where the full weight of the British justice system would begin to bear down on him. The romantic getaway that was supposed to strengthen his relationship with Sarah had instead destroyed his freedom and likely his future. Wellington, despite his injuries, was already planning to return to duty the next day. The attack had been shocking and painful, but it hadn't shaken his commitment to his service or his belief in the importance of maintaining royal security. He would carry the scars from Marcus's punch for weeks to come, but his dedication to his duties remained undiminished. The contrast between the two men's situations was stark. One had lost everything in a moment of uncontrolled rage, while the other had demonstrated the kind of character and professionalism that would likely advance his career and earn him the respect of his superiors and colleagues for years to come. 3 months later, Marcus Thompson stood in the dock of the Old Bailey, one of London's most famous criminal courts. The man who had impulsively lashed out at a royal guard looked smaller and more defeated than he had on that fateful morning at Buckingham Palace. His lawyer had negotiated a guilty plea in exchange for a reduced sentence, but Marcus still faced the very real possibility of spending the next 2 years in prison. The courtroom was packed with media representatives, legal observers, and members of the public who had followed the case since the dramatic footage first appeared on television. Marcus had become something of a symbol in the British press, representing either the decline of respect for authority or the dangerous effects of alcohol and unemployment, depending on which newspaper you read. Judge Margaret Thornton had presided over thousands of criminal cases during her career, but she had rarely seen such a clear-cut example of how a single moment of poor judgment could destroy a life. As she reviewed Marcus's file, she saw a man with no serious criminal history, a brief but honorable military service record, and testimonials from friends and family describing him as fundamentally decent despite his struggles with anger management. Sarah had stood by Marcus throughout the legal proceedings, though their relationship had been severely strained by the incident and its aftermath. She sat in the public gallery, nervously twisting her engagement ring, a piece of jewelry that now seemed to represent a future that might be impossible to achieve. The romantic weekend that was supposed to bring them closer together had instead forced them both to confront the reality of Marcus's destructive tendencies. Guard Wellington was present in the courtroom as well, called to testify about the assault and its impact on his life and service. His appearance was immaculate as always, his uniform pressed and his bearing straight despite the small scar that remained visible on his jaw where Marcus's punch had connected. He had returned to full duty within days of the incident, and had even been commended by his superiors for his professional response to the attack. During his testimony, Wellington spoke with the same calm, measured tone that he had used while detaining Marcus at Buckingham Palace. He described the incident, factually, without emotion or embellishment, focusing on the security implications of the attack rather than his personal injuries. When asked by Marcus's defense attorney whether he bore any ill will toward his attacker, Wellington replied simply that he understood Marcus had been dealing with personal problems and hoped he would get the help he needed. The prosecutor painted Marcus as a dangerous individual who had shown complete disregard for law and order by attacking a member of the Royal Guard in full view of the public. The assault had required additional security measures at royal events, had cost taxpayers thousands of pounds in legal proceedings, and had damaged Britain's reputation as a safe destination for tourists. The Crown sought a custodial sentence that would send a clear message about the consequences of such behavior. Marcus's defense attorney argued that his client was fundamentally a good man who had made a terrible mistake under the influence of alcohol and personal stress. She presented evidence of Marcus's struggles with unemployment, his relationship problems, and his history of mental health issues that had gone untreated since his discharge from the army. She requested a suspended sentence combined with community service and mandatory anger management counseling. When given the opportunity to address the court directly, Marcus stood and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. He apologized to Guard Wellington, to the royal family, to the tourists whose experience had been ruined by his actions, and to Sarah and his family who had been forced to endure the public shame of his behavior. His words were heartfelt, but everyone in the courtroom knew that apologies couldn't undo the damage he had caused. Judge Thornton deliberated for nearly an hour before returning to deliver her sentence. She acknowledged Marcus's remorse and his previously clean record, but emphasized that attacks on royal guards struck at the heart of British institutions and could not be treated lightly. She sentenced Marcus to 18 months in prison, suspended for 2 years, meaning he would avoid jail time as long as he completed 200 hours of community service and attended anger management counseling. The sentence was both a relief and a wake-up call for Marcus. He had avoided prison, but his life would never be the same. His assault conviction would appear on background checks for years to come, limiting his employment opportunities and affecting every aspect of his future. The moment of rage that had lasted seconds would have consequences that lasted decades. As Marcus left the courthouse with Sarah, they were met by a crowd of reporters and photographers eager to capture his reaction to the sentence. Sarah shielded him from the cameras as they made their way to their car, both of them understanding that this public humiliation was part of the price they would continue to pay for his actions. Guard Wellington returned to his duties at Buckingham Palace, where the incident had already become part of the unofficial history shared among the guards. His professional response to the attack had enhanced his reputation within the regiment, and he continued to serve with the same dedication and discipline that had defined his career from the beginning. The incident served as a stark reminder that in the age of social media and instant communication, a single moment of poor judgment could have consequences far beyond what previous generations might have imagined. For Marcus, the punch that had lasted seconds would be remembered and regretted for the rest of his life, while for Wellington, the professional way he handled the crisis would be remembered as an example of the best traditions of British military service.